There isn't much in the way of biotech that our guest on today's show has not done. Since earning his Ph.D. in physical chemistry at MIT, he's hopscotched across several intersections of the high-tech, life sciences, and financial industries, from running point on network incident response at Penn and doing disaster relief work for the American Red Cross in the early years of his career, to some great big startups like Google Life Sciences, where he was co-founder and CSO through its transition to Verily, and Grail, to academic work at UC Berkeley and Stanford, to more recently joining Foresite Capital Management and launching Foresite Labs. He's amassed a collection of experiences that give him a unique perspective on the opportunities that present themselves when science, technology, and money converge. I'm Matt Pillar. This is The Business of Biotech. And on today's episode, we're digging into that convergence of tech, science, and money with Dr. Vik Bajaj, a guy who's got a hand in a startup called Xiara Therapeutics out of the Foresite Labs ecosystem that's got some serious backing. We're going to get to know Vik and his biotech worldview. And more specifically, we'll dig into the big bets he's placing on technologies like AI and ML, demonstrated by the mansion, the billion-dollar mansion Xiara is building in a burgeoning industry full of cottages. Vik, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Very nice to meet you. And I've been looking forward to this conversation.
As have I, yeah. And just for the listeners' reference, before we started recording here, Vik and I were bantering a little bit about political influence on biotech, which wasn't on the bingo card for today's discussion, but may make its way to to our discussion after hearing some of your thoughts and opinions. But where I want to start is in the here and now. As I said, I rattled off quite a list of experiences that you've had in the space from day one, and currently you're responsible. You've got broad responsibility across three distinct I guess operating units or divisions or facets of Foresite. So I want to kind of get a lay of the land for the intersection of your work at Foresite Capital Management, Foresite Labs, and Xiara Therapeutics. Am I pronouncing that correctly, by the way? Xiara?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That's correct.
I want to get a lay of the land of the intersection of those and sort of the chronology of your work in each of them.
Well, let me start by talking a bit about Xiara because I think it gives some insight into how we do things. So Xiara is something that we launched jointly with my colleague and friend Bob Nelson at Arch, along with David Baker's group at the Institute for Protein Design. David Baker, as you know, was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work last month. And our model as investors is a little bit more operational than you would expect from an investment firm. We have an incubator, Foresite Labs, where we help to stand up and get these companies off the ground, bringing the pieces together, making sure that they're launched with the right operating infrastructure, and contributing where we can some elements of scientific platforms and other things that we've spent years developing. But our model then is to essentially hire our replacements and make sure that we can move on quickly to the next thing while the company is in the hands of its permanent management, in this case, under a brilliant CEO, Mark Tessier-Levine, and a team that includes both some of the most accomplished AI developers and practitioners and some of the most accomplished drug developers in the world. So that is in very good hands. And Bob and I, as representatives of Arch and Foresite, are on the board. Mm-hmm. But the company is now run by the stellar management team. And we try to help them where we can.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd like to get the get some. So let's go back to Foresite Labs then, because I'd like to dig into some of the, I guess, machine at Foresite Labs that that produces companies like Xiara. as I understand it, you correct me if I'm wrong. As I understand it, Foresight's sort of focus is on developing companies around these core technologies that you mentioned, core technologies like AI and ML. And I mean, I can make inferences looking at your LinkedIn profile. As I said, Google Life Sciences, Verily, like, yeah, this guy's coming at it with a bit of a tech bio bend or bias. But tell us why. Rationalize that for us, because I tried to make a play on words in the intro around building a mansion in an industry full of cottage, right? A little play on the cottage industry thing. But we see this cottage industry right now of small players, just a highly fractionalized industry of super small players that are not nearly as well funded as Xiara, coming at molecular discovery and design from an AI angle. You might even look at it and go, nascent, borderline saturated. Are we looking at like, where's the value? So I'm curious about your take on that and what differentiates the approach. I mean, besides dollars, what differentiates the approach that you guys are taking around building companies around this foundation of AI and ML? Long-winded question, I know.
No, but a good one. First of all, we're broadly focused on things that actually accelerate product development. I don't have to tell or remind your audience, but it's worth remembering that our industry is very peculiar. We have a 10-year product development cycle that is characterized by late-stage failures. It's not for the faint of heart. And part of that is really governed by our resort to empiricism at essentially every stage of the process. And there have been exceptions to that. The transformation of oncology from an entirely empirical discipline where broadly cytotoxic therapies were tested in broad patient populations to a completely different practice of precision oncology, where we understand the molecular and genetic drivers of cancer. We produce drugs that are precisely targeted to those drivers, and we both test and eventually deploy them in patients whose tumors actually harbor those drivers. That's an example of a transformation of the industry from something that is very empirical and artisanal to something that is not quite, but increasingly engineering-like, in the sense that there are predictable modular elements and predictable outcomes when those modular elements are employed, right? So what we're broadly interested in is how can you accelerate drug discovery, drug development, and even healthcare delivery. We can come back to that. That is the whole infrastructure that consumes 20% of US GDP and increasing, with miraculous outcomes, but still nowhere near good enough. So breaking that down, part of it is the long process, sometimes decades long, of understanding disease biology, understanding what targets cause disease rather than just are associated with disease. Those are the best drug targets. The second part of the process is actually making molecules of whatever kind that engage those targets in ways that reverse their malfunctions or induce a function that counteracts the disease process. Then, given that drug against a target that we believe to be real and causal in disease, you have to test the drug in clinical trials. And you want to do that in a patient population that's as small as possible, so the trial is as fast as possible, and where the success rate is high. And then you'd like to deploy that in a healthcare system, ideally that's tuned to the needs of the individual patient. In oncology, we now have, at least scientifically, the ability to manage the entire patient journey. We can measure who is at risk for cancer. We can target, as we did at GRAIL, people at highest risk for screening that is increasingly sophisticated. Once we find the cancer, we can measure other properties of the cancer to target therapies to it. We can watch those therapies succeed or not, and then we can even watch for recurrence using increasingly sophisticated assays. So again, turning to oncology, how can we accelerate that product development cycle, and how can we do something similar for all disease? That's the question we're asking.
Yeah.
In the ideal case, that would be precise, tailored to the needs of the individual. And it would also allow us to intervene in disease early, maybe ideally preventing it before the harm is done, or at least preventing the most deleterious consequences. So in that framework, we are convinced, I'm convinced, have been for a long time, that the methods of modern large-scale computation at first, and now machine learning in the last 5 years or more, are maturing to the point where they promise to do for our product development cycle what they've done in the technology industry, in the finance industry, and other parts of industry that have been thoroughly transformed. So that's what we've been really engaged with. And the question is to understand, when are those tools mature? When are the data sets even, when do they exist? When are they mature enough that those tools can be built? And then finally, how do you arrange that toolkit in a company that's actually capable of doing product development? Otherwise, you have to wait 5, 6, 7, 8 years to understand if your toolkit is even working.
Yeah.
So those themes are ones that we exercised in detail at Xiara, because the idea was to create a vertically integrated biopharma company whose mission from the beginning is to use this new and emerging toolkit to accelerate product development. And the pillars of Xiara, the people in Xiara, the funding structure reflects all of that. We brought into Xiara at inception efforts that, like David Baker's, that have a 10-year legacy of validation, or the Illumina intramural programs in data generation using perturbative experiments, functional genomics, that were also very advanced. And we did that so that these tools and technologies, as much as they'll contribute to a future pipeline of machine learning models, they're mature and ready to contribute to product development today. And so we also brought into Xiara really seasoned product developers like Debbie Law from BMS, who truly understand how to harness this infrastructure and turn it into drug programs that benefit patients. So that was the model and kind of set of themes that led to the model.
What's the stage of I don't know, maturation that we're at in terms of people like her who understand the ecosystem, the tools, and have the capability to bring it all together? And I ask that question because I get the sense, when you put your ear to the ground and listen to, groups of scientists and biotech in forums, for instance, you go on the biotech forum on Reddit, the subreddit, the biotech subreddit. You ever do that?
No, I try to avoid that. But I'm guessing that you're about to tell me why I try to avoid it. But yes, what
well, I may be, because I'm
fora?
wondering where the gap is, right? Like, if you put your ear to the ground and like I said, pay attention to, some ground level chatter around AI and machine learning and biotech, there remains a lot of skepticism, and much of that is surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, around a younger cohort, who maybe haven't been around the block in industry as much. Gives me the sense that industry is driving much of this innovation as opposed to academia. I'm wondering if academia is still kind of stovepiped in its approach to professing, teaching, and preparing, tech bio workers. You tell me, like, what does that landscape look like? What's the funnel look like for companies like Xiara and other companies that Foresite Labs is gonna churn out that rely on people who understand these intersections?
Well, there's a lot that to unpack in the question.
I ask these long-winded, multi-point questions.
No, but
Just
let's take it one at a time, right? One is you don't have the freedom to construct an organization from a hypothetical training pipeline that takes 20 years to create, right?
Mm.
And one thing I learned at Google in the life sciences program there, which we should come back to because it's like an AT&T Bell Labs environment that I feel really laid the foundations for a lot of what you're seeing in the space now.
Yeah.
Is how difficult it is to get different kinds of people to work together, and why. What are the problems you have to solve to do that? So I remember at Google at one point after we had launched a first clinical study, and there were a couple of hundred people on the team, a mixture of wet lab scientists, software engineers, and other kinds of engineers, and clinicians. I surveyed the team and I asked them this question: when do you think the first result of the study will impact clinical care of patients? And of course, the clinician said, well, this is an observational study. We'll learn something from here. It's going to lead to discoveries. Those have to be tested. That's a decade, 2 decade long cycle before there's any impact. And scientists are more optimistic. They're thinking about biomarkers, molecular factors, things that could impact product development. They thought, maybe in 5 years, we'd have some novel endpoints for a clinical trial or biomarkers from these observational studies. Software engineers thought that this would happen in a matter of months, that we would derive insights from a observational clinical study that were going to be transformative in healthcare. And, what that reflects are the different product development cycles of each of those disciplines. Their culture, their instruction, their training. We talk about bilingualism and all of these things. That's fine, that's important. But most important is to understand that in biotech and healthcare, we literally have a decade-long product development cycle. And for software engineers, that cycle is measured in weeks and months. Yeah. So getting those people to work together requires bridging those worlds, understanding the best of each, not sacrificing scientific rigor, but also not changing the way that software engineers work. In fact, importing that process much more into the practice of science. So now, the second question you asked was about the training environment or how people are trained. That's changed a lot too, right? When I was in grad school, in the quantitative disciplines, people had software engineering experience, but it wasn't really in the quantitative physical science disciplines, but it wasn't really rigorous in an engineering sense, unless a subset of us, you had worked outside of science in the software world and been exposed to that in some way, right? That was normal. Today, that's not normal at all. In people in biological AI, people in fields of statistics, biology, computer science that are touching machine learning, actually this generation of scientists has a understanding of all of the tools that industry uses for software engineering and software development. They had the mission to release tools that other people can use. They understand the open source community. They understand to some extent, and they're receptive to rigorous software engineering practice, release cycles, release calendars, requirements-based development, testing-based development. So that's changed. And, it's probably taken 15 years for that to change.
Yeah. So
I think the workforce that is coming in now today is way more informed in the disciplines that we need. And that actually, to your third point, reflects the practice of science in academia. It's no accident this year that 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different disciplines went to AI and ML. When I came to Google a long time ago, I was giving an all hands meeting, and I mentioned to all of the Google employees that, the best scientists, they are attracted to environments where they have new tools to accomplish their science. Because as scientists, it's not just what we find, but even the very questions we ask, the exploration you can conduct is circumscribed by the tools that you have available, at least as experimentalists, to understand the world around you.
Yeah.
And it was clear then that the tools that Google had developed for completely different purposes were going to be the best scientific tools of my generation of scientists. And that's why we all went there. That's played itself out in academia. So there is no part of academia today which doesn't use that toolkit to accomplish science. And we could go into 20 examples of that. But basically, academic science is aligned with the kind of themes that we were discussing before. The training environment reflects that. So there's a robust pipeline of people who understand that are coming into companies that we've started, like Xiara.
Yeah. I get the sense that in the time that you've spent since earning that physical chemistry degree, time spent at Google and elsewhere, you now lean decidedly into the software engineer mentality camp, where 5 months ought to be you know maybe 5 months is aggressive, but you get my point. Like, if you had to pick, like, where does Vik Bajaj live right now in terms of reality, product lifecycle development, product development timeframes versus where we want to be?
So this goes to, I think, something you mentioned before was implicit in your last question, right? Which is like, when is any of this stuff actually going to accelerate product development?
Mm.
Think about it now. We have to hold ourselves to the utmost standard of evidence. Let me give you an example of what we did at Grail, right? Grail is running now one of the largest clinical trials ever attempted. I think probably the largest outside of vaccine trials, right? Why does the trial have to be that large? Well, the goal of our product at Grail was to develop a blood test that's capable of screening for many, many different cancers. That means that you need to show that you can detect all those cancers. And also, it would be unconscionable to tell the patient that, well, you have cancer somewhere in your body. We don't know where it is. Now you have to do some kind of workup to find it. That would be very unconscionable. So it also has to be exquisitely precise about the site of origin. Now, if you want to do that for 20 different cancers, you are faced with two facts. One is that every cancer is slightly different, and you have to study all of them because you have to be able to tell them apart. So it is not one disease, but dozens of diseases that are related but different. So that immediately means that you need a much larger patient population because you have to have a representative number of all of these cancers. Second, we want to see, to prove that the product works, healthy people get cancer that the test can detect earlier. Now, cancer kills an enormous number of people. It's a sad fact. But the reality is the chances of any healthy person getting cancer in a year are exceedingly low. So that means now you have to enroll even more people because you have to have statistical power. You have to anticipate that you will see this number of healthy people get cancer and 20 different cancers in a reasonable clinical trial timeframe, which in this case is 3 years. So those things that I've all recited are scientific facts about statistics. They're scientific facts about human biology that it's very unlikely that machine learning can impact or change. And we can't pretend that that this toolkit will absolve us of the responsibility to generate the most reliable evidence for interventions that are incredibly expensive economically. We're always going to have to generate that evidence. So one question that we're asking is, how can you systematically accelerate the generation of medical evidence? There's many ways to do that. There's many ways that machine learning can be applied to do that. There's also many ways that just business model innovation can be applied to do that as well. And that's equally important. But you can never shrink that. I mean, never say never, but with no foreseeable data set, no foreseeable technology, could you shrink that to a 5-month process and be sure that it's safe and effective, which is ultimately the responsibility that, we're held to.
Yeah. It's that may be an interesting foray to touch on some of the discussion we were having before we hit the record button around political influence, because I'm curious, as you describe this, some of these, I guess, facets or factors that play into the development time when you're running a biotech business. I'm thinking about the fact that we're in we're at an inflection point, at least seemingly, we're at an inflection point looking at the next 4 years around the way that agencies like the FDA conduct business. Like there's, based on some of the appointments we've seen in the last few days, there's a likelihood that at least there's going to be a strong influence for change. Can One, do you see that as an opportunity? Do you see that as an opportunity for, HHS and FDA and CDC to kind of take a look around and say, what can we be doing differently to enable, uh, at least work in lockstep with the efficiencies that we see coming out of industry? And so another two-part question. One, do you see an opportunity there? And two, do you think, do, do you have reason to hope or speculate that those agencies, FDA in particular, and it's the role it plays in drug development, do you have reason to believe that that they can enable some of these, embrace even some of these inefficiencies? Because this is revolutionary technology. We see it play out over the next several years that could have very real implications on how fast you expect a company that you're investing in, like Xiara, to move
Yes.
through the clinic.
So, I mean, I'll try to lay out the positive potential and then maybe talk about some things that would impede that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, one is that as much as we complain about the regulator at times, what the regulator does, especially in the United States, is largely focused on what it's supposed to focus on: safety and efficacy.
Yeah.
And the arguments that the regulator invokes are not unlike the arguments that I was reciting in relation to Grail's clinical trial size, right? There's a quantum of evidence that's needed to prove a claim. And that quantum of evidence is not totally independent of how you generate the evidence, but you have to satisfy that, right? Mm. And that's what the regulator does. And for the most part, if you have innovations, take cancer biomarkers, basket trials in cancer, we could recite a lot of examples. There's a path to convince the regulator that what you're doing is reasonable, that it represents a well-defined patient population, that you are causing much more good than harm by doing whatever it is that you're doing that's innovative. You know, the regulator doesn't care if we use machine learning to automate the drudgery of preparing all the materials that go into clinical trials. In fact, those things reduce errors, and there's a path to include them that's relatively straightforward. If we have novel clinical trial endpoints, time and time again, there are paths to include them that are appropriately difficult, but they're not opaque, they're not mystical. That said, there's also areas where the regulator can improve, can accelerate. And there we should take comfort that there's been, bipartisan set of individuals who are committed to that principles, all of them. I'll name two that I work with personally. One is Rob Califf, who's a dear friend and was a mentor to me when he was at Google. He is extremely committed to the idea of accelerating the generation of clinical evidence without sacrificing rigor in every way possible. There's probably no human on the planet who's run more large clinical trials than Commissioner Califf has and Rob has. But he's very committed to innovation at every step of the process. And the other one, Scott Gottlieb, different party. He's someone who we work with at Xiara. He is equally committed to innovation, creating paths for these new tools and technologies to come forward, actually creating business incentives to work with the regulator in unique ways. So I'm kind of comforted that there's this whole bipartisan infrastructure set of individuals that start with the basic scientific premise that we have to prove these things are safe, we have to prove they're effective, and then let's pull every lever. Let's consider any innovative path to demonstrate those two things more and more quickly, to just accelerate how much we learn. And as long as they start from that scientific premise, broadly speaking, I can't even really tell the difference overall between people from different parties who've held that role, because they're all committed to the same things. Now, what happens if that premise is challenged, that it's no longer science-based? There's some other principles that are being served that are mixed up in the regulatory process. That's what I worry about, because the outcome there is not something that that I could predict. And it's not clear that then people would be following the same incentives and rules. And in that framework, it's not clear how the professional staff at the FDA would even react to different kinds of incentives and pressures. Right. So that I'm worried about because it's so unpredictable. But what is predictable is you start from that patient-centered, science-based premise that people of radically different political persuasions all find ways consistent with their politics and their worldviews to make the process more efficient.
So many should have such I don't want to say rosy, but a bipartisan and tempered approach.
Well, that's what we've had until, well, we don't know what we have today.
Yeah, we don't know.
That's what we've had for sure until today.